Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
When I was 17, I worked part-time at a mall at Pop Ice Cream Parlor in my hometown. It was an old-fashioned kind of place with checkered floors, shiny red stools, and a clunky cash register that dinged when you opened it. The job was quiet, especially on weekday evenings when the only customers were the occasional family or a couple of teenagers killing time. One Friday night, my manager asked me to close up alone for the first time. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I'd seen him do it a dozen times and figured I could handle it. Plus, the shop closed at 9 p.m., so it wasn't like I'd be there late. Around 8:45 p.m., the shop was completely empty and I was wiping down the counters when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up to see a woman walk in. She was probably in her late 30 seconds, wearing a beige trench coat that looked too warm for the mild spring weather. Her hair was pulled back tightly and she had this unsettling, wide smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Hi there," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "Still open?" I nodded. "Yeah, we're open for another 15 minutes. What can I get you?" She walked slowly past the counter, her eyes darting around the shop like she was searching for something. Finally, she settled on a small table near the back and sat down. "Actually, I'm not ready yet. Do you mind if I take a minute to decide?" Something about her made me uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude. "Sure, take your time," I said, then went back to cleaning. Minutes ticked by, and she didn't move. She didn't even look at the menu. She just sat there, her hands clasped tightly on the table, staring at me with that same unnerving smile. By 8:55, I decided to remind her we were closing soon. "Ma'am, we'll be closing in a few minutes. Can I get you anything?" Her smile faltered, and for a moment, I thought she was angry, but then she tilted her head and said, "Oh, I'm not really here for the ice cream." My stomach dropped. I tried to laugh it off. "Oh, then why are you here?" Her smile returned, wider this time. "I waited." The way she said it made my skin crawl. "Waiting for what?" "Not what," she replied, her tone sing-song. "Who?" Before I could respond, the bell above the door jingled again. A man walked in, tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. He didn't look at me. He didn't even glance at the woman. He just walked straight to the counter. "We're closing soon," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. Then, without warning, he reached over the counter and grabbed my wrist. "Hey, let go," I yelled, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. The woman's voice cut through the air. "Step." "Not yet." The man froze, still holding my wrist. The woman stood up and slowly walked over to us, her heels clicking on the tiled floor. She leaned in close, her face inches from mine. "You're not the one," she whispered. Then, to the man, she said, "Let her go." He released me immediately, and I stumbled back, clutching my wrist. The woman turned to him and nodded toward the door. "Let's go. We're done here." Without another word, they both walked out, the bell jingling softly as the door swung shut behind them. I locked the door the second they were gone and called my manager, barely able to get the words out as I explained what had just happened. The police came and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. The shop's security cameras were old and grainy, and they couldn't make out the faces of either the man or the woman. They told me it was probably just a couple of weirdos trying to scare me, but I wasn't so sure. A few weeks later, I was working an afternoon shift when a regular customer came in. Mrs. Patterson was an elderly woman who lived nearby and often came by for a single scoop of butter pecan. She'd always chat with me about her garden or her grandchildren, and it was a nice break from the monotony. That day, as I handed her the cone, she paused and looked at me closely. "You look tired, dear. Everything all right?" I hesitated, then decided to tell her a watered-down version of what had happened that night. As I described the woman and her unsettling behavior, Mrs. Patterson's face grew pale. "Did you say a beige trench coat?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I replied, confused. "Why?" She shook her head, her hand gripping the counter for support. "Years ago, there was a woman who used to wander this area, wearing a trench coat just like that. People said she'd show up at random places, waiting for someone. There were rumors she was part of some cult, looking for new members. But one day, she just disappeared. No one ever saw her again." My blood ran cold. Mrs. Patterson must have noticed because she reached out and patted my hand. "It's probably just a coincidence, dear. Don't think too much about it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a coincidence. I started noticing little things. A car parked across the street for hours, strangers lingering near the shop longer than seemed normal. Nothing ever happened, but the unease never left me. I quit the job a few months later when I left for college. Years later, I returned to my hometown for the holidays. Walking down Main Street, I passed the old ice cream parlor, now shuttered and abandoned. abandoned. The windows were dusty, the sign faded, but I couldn't help stopping to stare. Memories of that night rushed back, and a shiver ran down my spine. As I stood there, I felt a distinct sensation of being watched. Turning quickly, I scanned the street. It was mostly empty, save for a few passersby. Then I saw it. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, was a woman in a beige trench coat. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and though the distance made it hard to be sure, I could have sworn she was smiling. I didn't wait to confirm. I turned and walked away, my pace quickening with every step. Months after my visit, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a faded photograph of the ice cream parlor taken long before I worked there. Standing in front of it were two figures, a man in a dark hoodie and a woman in a beige trench coat. The photo looked old, decades old, but the faces were unmistakably theirs. I stared at the picture, my hands trembling. On the back, scrawled in messy handwriting, were the words, "We'll be waiting." I moved shortly after, and to them, wherever they are, I hope we never meet again. This happened a few years ago when I was living in a small, quiet town where nothing much ever happened. I didn't have a washer or dryer at home, so I'd go to this 24-hour laundromat a few blocks away. It was always a bit eerie at night, with its flickery fluorescent lights and the rhythmic hum of machines, but it was cheap and convenient, so I didn't mind. One Friday night, around 11 p.m., I decided to do my laundry. I figured the place would be empty and I'd have the machines to myself. When I got there, I was right at first. I loaded my clothes into a machine in the corner and sat down to scroll through my phone while I waited. A few minutes in, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a woman standing by the door. She was just standing there, not moving, not holding any laundry, just staring inside. She didn't look homeless or anything, just normal, mid-30s, wearing jeans and a hoodie. Her face was blank, almost like she was in a trance. I tried to ignore her and went back to my phone, but every time I glanced up, she was still there, staring. I started to feel uneasy. Maybe she was waiting for someone, I thought, or maybe she was just deciding whether to come in. But after 10 minutes of this, it started to feel off. I looked at her directly, hoping she'd get the hint and either come in or leave, but her eyes locked onto mine. And then she smiled, not a friendly smile, not even a creepy one. It was like her face just twisted into this too wide grin, like she was forcing herself to look happy. Her teeth were perfectly straight, too perfect, almost unnatural. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped inside, walking slowly toward me. She didn't blink, didn't stop smiling. She wasn't carrying anything, no laundry, no bag, nothing. Just walking straight toward me, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. I stood up, my heart racing. "Hey, seriously, do you need something?" She stopped about 10 feet away from me. The grin disappeared, and she tilted her head to one side, like she was studying me. Then she whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "You shouldn't be here." "What?" I asked, my voice shaking now. She didn't repeat herself. Instead, she turned sharply and walked toward the back of the laundromat, disappearing behind the rows of machines. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Should I leave? Call someone? But then I thought, what if she's messing with me? Maybe she was drunk or high. I decided to wait it out. I didn't hear any footsteps, no rustling, nothing. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to peek around the machines to see where she went. She wasn't there. The back of the laundromat was a dead end, just a row of dryers and a small supply closet. There was no way she could have left without me hearing her. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I backed up toward the door, grabbed my still wet clothes from the washer, and bolted out of there. As I hurried down the street, I glanced back at the laundromat one last time. She was standing at the window, her face pressed against the glass, grinning that impossibly wide grin. I wish I could say that was the end of it. I tried to move on. I started going to a different laundromat a little farther away, even though it was more expensive. For a while, things were fine. A few weeks passed, and I convinced myself it had just been a strange, one-off encounter. Maybe she was some unhinged person, and I just happened to be the unlucky target of her weirdness. But then, little things started happening. The first time, it was subtle. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of a faint humming. At first, I thought it was my neighbor's TV or something, but it didn't quite sound right. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical, like the sound of a washing machine. I live alone, and I don't even have a washer, so it didn't make any sense. I'd sit up in bed, heart pounding, but the sound would always stop the moment I tried to pinpoint it. The next incident was harder to explain. I was folding laundry in my bedroom when I noticed noticed a piece of clothing that didn't belong to me. It was a plain gray hoodie, similar to the one that woman had been wearing. I froze. I hadn't picked it up by accident. It definitely wasn't in the basket when I brought my laundry home from the new place. I grabbed it with shaking hands, tossed it into a garbage bag, and threw it into the dumpster outside. But that night, I heard the humming again, louder this time. The next morning, I found the hoodie folded neatly on my kitchen table. I completely lost it. I called a friend and begged him to come over. I didn't even know how to explain what was happening without sounding insane, but they came anyway. We searched my entire apartment together, every closet, every cupboard, even under the bed. Nothing, no signs of forced entry, no clues as to how the hoodie had ended up back in my apartment. After my friend left, I decided to get out of the house for a bit. I went for a drive, just to clear my head. I didn't have a destination in mind, but somehow I ended up near the old laundromat. I don't know why, I certainly hadn't meant to go there, but as I drove past, I saw her. She was standing outside, right where she'd been the first time, staring in through the glass door. Only this time, she wasn't smiling. Her face was blank, her eyes dark and hollow. She didn't look like the woman I'd seen before. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her features seemed distorted, like they'd been stretched too far. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove home as fast as I could, locked all my doors and windows, and sat in my living room with every light in the house on. That night, I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was back in the laundromat. It was empty, except for the hum of the machines. I looked around, and there she was, standing in the corner, her grin wider than ever. She didn't move or speak. She just pointed at one of the washing machines. When I looked inside, I saw myself, my reflection, but it wasn't moving like I was. It stared back at me with that same eerie grin, and its hand reached out of the glass. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, but when I sat up in bed, I realized something was wrong. The faint humming was back, but it wasn't coming from outside or another apartment. It was coming from my closet. I sat there frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The humming was unmistakable now, steady, mechanical, relentless. My bedroom closet, which had always seemed so ordinary, suddenly felt like the mouth of some dark, yawning void. I didn't want to move, didn't want to even breathe, but my eyes were locked on the door. It wasn't closed all the way. The tiniest sliver of blackness peeked out, like the closet itself was watching me. My heart pounded in my chest so hard it felt like it would break through my ribs. But the worst part wasn't the sound, or the creeping terror of the door. It was the smell. A faint, sickly sweet odor wafted into the room, like decaying flowers or moldy fabric. It was subtle at first, but as the humming grew louder, the smell became overwhelming. It felt thick, almost tangible, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely keep a grip on it, but I managed to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing squarely on the closet door. The humming stopped. Just like that, it was silent again. Too silent. No faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen, no sound of cars outside, just a suffocating, unnatural stillness. I kept the light trained on the closet, my pulse roaring in my ears. Then, the door creaked. It opened just an inch, but in the stillness, the sound felt deafening. My breath hitched, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, paralyzed, as the door slowly opened wider. And that's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a bundle of clothes piled in the corner of the closet. But then the pile shifted, and something pale emerged, a hand. It was impossibly long and thin, with fingers that curled like claws. The hand reached out, gripping the edge of the door, and pulled it open farther. My flashlight flickered. In the brief, stuttery light, I saw her, the woman, or whatever she was, crouched inside the closet, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her grin stretched so far across her face it looked like her skin might tear. She was wearing the same gray hoodie I'd thrown away, but it hung on her frame like it didn't quite fit, like her limbs were too long and her body wasn't shaped right. She crawled forward, her movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. I scrambled backward, falling off the bed and landing hard on the floor. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled away, casting erratic shadows across the room. "Why did you come back?" she whispered, her voice raspy and broken, like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head again, her grin somehow growing wider. "But you brought me with you." I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing under the harsh glow of a streetlight. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't unlock my car at first. When I finally got in, I floored it and didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town. I didn't go back to that apartment, ever. I called a movie company the next day and paid them extra to pack up my stuff without me. I didn't even want to step foot in there again. I moved to a new place on the other side of town, and for a while, things were normal. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the faint hum of a washing machine, somewhere in the distance. And when I do, I know she's not far. She's waiting, somewhere in the shadows, smiling that impossibly wide smile. I used to work the night shift at a gas station off a desolate highway. It was one of those places where the nearest town is miles away, and we'd barely get a customer between 1 and 4 a.m. My manager loved to joke that this station was the last light before the abyss. After this encounter, I think he might have been right. It was a Wednesday. A little after 2 a.m. I was restocking the cold drink cooler when I heard the automatic door slide open. I peeked through the shelves, expecting to see a trucker or maybe some tired traveler, but the person standing there gave me pause. She was barefoot, wearing a white dress that looked more like a nightgown, stained with dirt at the hem. Her hair was matted, and her eyes were wide, darting around like she was trying to remember where she was. She didn't look drunk or high, just lost it. "Hi there," I said, stepping out from behind the counter. "Do you need help?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked straight to the snack aisle, her bare feet making almost no sound on the linoleum. She picked up a bag of chips, stared at it for a moment, then set it down and moved to the next shelf. I tried asking again, "Ma'am, are you okay?" That's when she turned to me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I felt my stomach drop. She didn't blink. "That was..." Then she said, in this flat, almost robotic tone, "They're coming. They're almost here." "Who's coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I dealt with weirdos before, but this felt different. "Rug." She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head like she was listening for something. Then she smiled, this slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "You should leave." No. I was about to call the police when the lights in the station flickered. For a split second, everything went pitch black. When the lights came back on, she was gone. The doors hadn't opened, and I hadn't heard her leave, but she was nowhere to be found. I ran outside, scanning the parking lot and the highway, but it was empty. No cars, no footprints, nothing. I went back inside and locked the doors. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just some drifter messing with me. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the cooler I'd been restocking earlier. I froze. The tapping got louder, more insistent, like someone was knocking from the inside. Slowly, I walked over, my hands trembling as I opened the cooler door. Nothing, just rows of soda bottles and energy drinks. I let out a shaky laugh, thinking I must be imagining things. And then, as I closed the door, I saw her reflection in the glass behind me, standing right there. I drove home that night faster than I probably should have. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see her sitting in the backseat, still smiling at me with those unnerving, unblinking eyes. But the car was empty, and I made it home without incident. I barely slept. Every creak in my house, every shadow cast by the street lights outside made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow still with me. But when morning came and the sunlight poured through my windows, I started to feel ridiculous. Maybe I'd been overtired. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe my mind had just played tricks on me. The next day, I told my manager what happened. He chuckled, then said something that chilled me. "Oh yeah, the barefoot girl. She's been around here before." "What?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Yeah, some of the other night guys have mentioned her. She shows up, acts weird, then vanishes. People say this stretch of highway is haunted, you know, lots of stories, accidents, disappearances, that kind of thing. Maybe she's one of them." I wanted to laugh it off, but his tone wasn't joking. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" He shrugged. "Didn't think it'd matter. She hasn't hurt anyone, right?" I didn't say anything. I couldn't stop thinking about her reflection in the glass, that smile that didn't seem remotely human. A week went by, and I avoided night shifts entirely. I even started carrying a flashlight and pepper spray, just in case. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me. At home, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. My dog, normally fearless, started whining at nothing, staring at the dark corners of the room with her tail tucked between her legs. Then, a few nights later, it happened again. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with TV, when the power flickered. Just like at the gas station, the lights cut out completely for a few seconds. When they came back on, my dog was gone. Her leash was still hanging by the door, and there was no way she could have gotten out. I locked everything. I called her name, searched the entire house, even checked outside, but she was nowhere to be found. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were small, bare, and muddy, leading from my front door to the hallway. My stomach churned as I followed them, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trail led to my bedroom, where the door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. She was standing in the corner, her back to me. Her white dress was even dirtier than before, and her hair hung in tangled clumps. My dog was lying at her feet, completely still. "Ted," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get out of my house." She didn't move. I stepped closer, my hand on the pepper spray, and repeated, "Get out, or I'll call the police." That's when she turned around, and I saw her face. It wasn't the same as before. Her eyes were pitch black, her skin pale and stretched tight over her skull. Her smile had grown impossibly wide, and her teeth were, too many of them, sharp and jagged, like a shark's. "You didn't leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in a way that shouldn't have been possible in such a small room. "You should have left." The lights flickered again. again, and when they came back on, she and my dog were gone. The only thing left was the muddy footprints, which now led back to the front door and out into the night. I haven't seen her since, but I've moved 3 times in the last year just to be safe. Months passed, but the unease never went away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I thought I was safe, something small would happen to remind me she, or whatever she was, wasn't done with me yet. It whispered when I was alone, flickering lights, footsteps echoing where there shouldn't be any. And then, last week, I found the note. It was taped to the windshield of my car when I left work. It was just a scrap of lined paper, but the handwriting was eerily neat, each letter precise and deliberate. It read, "You moved, but you didn't leave. They're closer now." I don't know what she meant by they, and I don't want to find out. My first instinct was to throw the note away, but something stopped me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like a warning, like ignoring it would only make things worse. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house felt magnified, like something was moving just out of sight. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of her. She was standing at the foot of my bed, her face blank and emotionless, except for that awful smile. "They're coming," she said again, but this time, she added something else, "and you brought them." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dream had felt so real, but it was just a dream, wasn't it? The next morning, I noticed something odd. The neighbor's dog, who usually barked at anything that moved, was silent. When I went outside, I saw the reason why. His chain was still attached to the post in the yard, but he was gone. The metal clasp looked like it had been snapped clean in half, as if something had yanked it apart with a human strength. That's when I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. I packed a bag and drove as far as I could to a small motel off a different highway. It felt like deja vu, another desolate place, another faint flicker of hope that I could outrun whatever was happening to me. The first night at the motel was quiet, and I started to think maybe I made the right call. But on the second night, I heard it again. The tapping. It started on the motel room window, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. I pulled back the curtain, but there was nothing there, just the empty parking lot, lit by a flickering neon sign. I told myself it was the wind, even as I heard it again, this time on the bathroom door. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. The bathroom door was open just a crack, and in the sliver of darkness beyond, I saw her eyes, black, empty, and staring straight at me. "You should have left," she whispered. The lights in the room went out. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the door, but before I could reach it, I felt something grab my wrist. Cold, clammy, impossibly strong. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When the lights flickered back on, she was gone. But I wasn't alone. The room was filled with shadows, shapes that didn't belong to anything I could see. They moved, shifting and twisting, as if they were alive. And then, one by one, they started to take form. Faces, limbs, mouths filled with teeth. They didn't move like people. They didn't move like anything I've ever seen. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, driving as fast as I could. I didn't stop until the sun came up, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. Now, I'm writing this from another motel somewhere even farther away, but I know it's only a matter of time. The shadows, the voices, they're not just following me, they're getting closer. If you've read this far, do me a favor, don't ignore the warnings. Don't wait for the lights to flicker or the tapping to start. If you ever see her, the barefoot girl in the white dress, just leave. Don't ask questions, don't look back, just go. Because once she finds you, she's not the only one you have to worry about. This happened a few years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I used to work late shifts at a small diner just outside of town. My car was in the shop for what felt like forever, so I relied on the city bus to get home. Most nights, the bus was nearly empty. Just me, a few other exhausted workers, and maybe the occasional late night wanderer. One Friday, my shift ended later than usual because we had a surprise inspection. By the time I made it to the bus stop, it was close to midnight. The stop was on a quiet street with just one flickering street light. It was a crisp, clear night, and the street was eerily empty. As I waited, I noticed a figure standing a bit further down the sidewalk, leaning against a telephone pole. They were partially hidden in the shadows, but I could tell they were watching me. I tried to ignore them, assuming it was just another night owl waiting for the bus. A few minutes passed, and I started to feel uneasy. The figure hadn't moved at all, not even shifting their weight or turning their head, just standing there, perfectly still, like a statue. Then I heard it, a low, humming noise, like someone softly singing or mumbling, but it didn't sound. Doorbell. It was off-key, like a broken lullaby mixed with static. I glanced over, and the figure was still in the same spot, but now it seemed closer. Not by much, maybe a step or two, but I hadn't seen them move. I decided to check my phone, partly to distract myself and partly to avoid looking at them. No messages, no new notifications, just the glowing screen reflecting my anxious face. The humming grew louder. I dared another glance, and my stomach dropped. The figure was now directly under the flickering streetlight, still as a statue, but I could finally make out some details. Their clothes were tattered, like they'd been dragged through mud and gravel, and their face. I still can't explain it. It wasn't that it was grotesque or deformed, it was just wrong. Their features didn't sit right, like they were slightly too close together or maybe stretched in the wrong places. And their eyes, they weren't glowing, but they had this sheen to them, like oil slicks catching the light. I froze. The humming stopped, and then they smiled. Not a warm, friendly smile. It was too wide, stretching their face in an unnatural way. It felt like they were mocking me, playing with my fear. I stood up and backed away, ready to bolt down the street, but be damned. But as I did, the figure tilted their head like a curious dog and took one deliberate step forward. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I turned and sprinted down the street as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, and I didn't dare look back. When I reached the next major intersection, I finally spotted the bus pulling up to the curb. I waved frantically and jumped on. As the doors closed, I risked a glance out the window. The street was empty. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just paranoid after the encounter, or perhaps I had misunderstood what I'd seen. But the feeling persisted, especially when I was alone. It wasn't just a general unease either, it was specific. I felt it most strongly when I was near windows or walking down long, empty streets. It felt like a pair of unseen eyes boring into my back, always out of sight but never far away. One night, a few weeks after the bus stop incident, I was home alone. My roommate was out of town visiting family, and I decided to have a quiet night in. I tried to keep myself busy, watching TV, scrolling through my phone, anything to keep my mind from wandering. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I heard it again, the humming. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe a song on TV had a similar tone, or maybe I was just projecting my fear. But no, when I muted the TV, the sound was still there. It was faint, like it was coming from somewhere outside. My heart started racing. I told myself not to panic, not to overreact. It was probably just a neighbor or someone passing by on the street. I got up and walked cautiously to the front window, peeking through the blinds. The street outside was empty. The humming grew louder. It wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from the backyard. I froze, my mind racing. My house backed up to a wooded area, and while it wasn't unusual for animals to wander close, this was no animal. The humming was rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakably human. I crept to the back door, my hands trembling as I flipped the lock and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside. The backyard was bathed in pale moonlight, and at first, I didn't see anything. But then, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw a figure. It was the same one from the bus stop. They were standing perfectly still, just like before, staring directly at the house. Even from that distance, I could see their twisted smile, their unnerving eyes glinting in the moonlight. The humming stopped, and then they moved, not towards the house, not away from it. They started pacing back and forth along the tree line, their movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. I panicked. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering frantically to the operator about someone in my yard. They assured me an officer would be dispatched and told me to stay on the line. As I waited, I kept my eyes on the figure. They didn't come any closer, but their pacing grew faster, more erratic, like they were agitated. The smile never left their face. It felt like an eternity before I saw the flashing lights of the police car. The figure stopped pacing and turned, disappearing into the woods in an instant, like they'd been waiting for their cue to leave. The officers searched the area but found no trace of anyone. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, nothing. They assured me it was probably just a prank or a drifter passing through, but their dismissive tone didn't ease my fear. That night, I didn't sleep. In the weeks that followed, the humming came back a few more times. Always faint, always distant, but enough to keep me on edge. I moved out of that house not long after, and I haven't heard it since. A few years passed, and while I moved to a different city and done my best to move on, the memory of the humming and that twisted smile never fully left me. Every so often, I think I caught a glimpse of someone out of the corner of my eye, a figure too still, too unnatural. But when I turned to look, there was never anyone there. I started to wonder if it had all been in my head. Maybe I built it up in my mind, exaggerating the details over time. Therapy helped me process some of the fear, and I began to convince myself that whatever I'd experienced was over. Until last month, it was a Saturday night, and I was out with some friends at a bar downtown. It had been a good night, lots of laughter, good drinks, and the kind of carefree energy I hadn't felt in years. By the time I decided to head home, it was late, but I wasn't worried. The streets downtown were well lit, and the ride rideshare app showed my driver was only a few minutes away. As I stood on the curb waiting, I noticed a street performer a little ways down. They were dressed in a tattered, mismatched outfit, and their head was bowed as they swayed back and forth to some strange, halty melody. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another eccentric artist trying to catch the late night crowd. But then, I realized the melody sounded familiar. It was humming. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was just a coincidence, a random tune that happened to resemble the one from my nightmare. But as I watched, the performer's movements grew more erratic, their swaying turning into jerky, puppet-like motions. And then they stopped. Slowly, they lifted their head, and my heart nearly stopped. It was them, the same unsettling smile, the same two wide eyes, the same air of wrongness that made every instinct in my body scream to run. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I fumbled for my phone, trying to cancel the rideshare and call for help, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped it on the pavement. When I looked up, they were closer. I didn't see them move. I never do, but they were now standing at the edge of the light from the street lamp, their face partially obscured by shadow. "I've missed you," they said, their voice a raspy whisper that somehow carried through the night air. I don't remember much after that. I must have grabbed my phone and run, because the next thing I knew, I was in my apartment, every door locked and bolted, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Now, every time I step outside, I feel like they're watching me. I don't know how they found me, or what they want, but I know this isn't over. If you're reading this and you ever hear that humming, please don't ignore it. Don't look for the source. Don't try to convince yourself it's nothing, because once they find you, they don't let go. This happened to me about 5 years ago, and to this day, I'm not sure if I imagined it or if it was something worse. I live in a mid-sized city with an old, labyrinthine subway system. It's not like the sleek, modern ones you see in movies. Our trains are relics, noisy and dimly lit, clattering down tunnels that smell of damp concrete and burnt metal. I worked late shifts back then, so catching the last train was a regular thing for me. One night, I missed the second to last train because of a sudden downpour. I ducked into a convenience store, waiting for the rain to let up, and by the time I got to the station, the place was nearly empty. It was a little unsettling to see the platform so quiet. The usual hum of people and announcements had been replaced by a hollow, echoing silence. When the train finally arrived, I stepped on and realized I was the only passenger in the car. That wasn't uncommon for the last train of the night, so I settled into my usual spot near the middle of the car and pulled out my phone. The train started moving, the wheels screeching against the tracks, and I busied myself scrolling through Instagram. I don't know how long it was before I noticed something wasn't right. The lights in the car began to flicker, not the occasional buzz and blink, but a rhythmic stuttering that made it hard to focus. Then I realized the train wasn't stopping. It should have hit 3 stations by now, but it just kept barreling forward, the darkness of the tunnel stretching endlessly on both sides. I glanced up from my phone and froze. Across the car, a man was sitting in the seat directly facing mine. Here's the thing, I know he wasn't there when I boarded. I had checked, almost instinctively, because late night rides can attract some sketchy people, but there he was now, sitting perfectly still, staring straight at me. He was rugged. His clothes were outdated, like something from the 1940s, a gray suit and a wide-brimmed hat. His skin was pale and waxy, and his eyes were so sunken they looked more like shadows than anything else. What stood out the most, though, was how impossibly still he was. Not even the slight sway of the train seemed to affect him. I tried to act normal, glancing away and pretending to fiddle with my phone, but I couldn't help stealing quick looks at him. Each time, he was a little closer. First, he was at the far end of the car, then halfway down, then in the seat across the aisle from me. I didn't see him move. He was just there. At this point, my heart was pounding and my mind was racing with excuses. Maybe he was some sort of performer trying to mess with me. Maybe I was just tired and my eyes were playing tricks on me. I wanted to get up and move to another car, but something about him felt paralyzing, like if I stood up, I'd break some unspoken rule and things would get worse. Then he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. His lips stretched far too wide, his teeth unnaturally small and sharp, like needles crammed into a too big mouth. He tilted his head, as if studying me, and I swear I heard a low chuckle, though his mouth never moved after that smile. The train jolted, and I broke out of my frozen state. I stood up and ran for the door to the next car. It was locked. I started banging on it, yelling, hoping anyone was in there and could hear me. When I turned back, the man was gone, but his hat was lying on the seat where I'd been sitting. I didn't think. I just kept banging until I felt the train slowing down. It finally stopped, the doors opened, and I sprinted out onto an unfamiliar platform. It was completely deserted, no signs, no maps, just a single flight of stairs leading up to a black iron gate. I turned to look back at the train, and the man was standing in the window, still smiling that awful smile. As the train pulled away, the lights in the car flickered one last time, and I swear I saw other faces behind him. pressed against the glass. I climbed the stairs and found myself in an alley I didn't recognize, but I kept running until I found a street with people. I eventually called a cab to take me home, but I never figured out where I was or how I got there. For years, I avoided the subway entirely. I'd take buses, walk miles, even call out sick if I couldn't find another way. Something about that night had latched onto me, gnawing at the edges of my mind whenever I let myself think about it for too long. I tried to tell myself it was a nightmare, maybe a stress-induced hallucination, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then, a few weeks ago, I got stuck in traffic during a torrential rainstorm. I was late for a meeting and, against my better judgment, I decided to take the subway. I told myself it had been years, that nothing weird would happen, and that my fear was irrational. The station looked the same, but I felt different. Older, sure, but also, lure away, I scanned every face, every shadow, my ears tuned for even the slightest sound. Nothing seemed out of place. When the train arrived, it was packed with commuters, and I felt a surge of relief. I stepped on, wedging myself between a guy in a business suit and a teenager with headphones, and held onto the pole. For most of the ride, everything was normal. The usual hum of conversation, the occasional buzz of a phone, the rhythmic screech of the wheels. It was almost comforting. But as we approached my stop, something caught my eye. A reflection. I was standing near the window, and for a split second, I thought I saw a familiar face in the glass, pale skin, sunken eyes, that too wide smile. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there, just a woman in a scarf scrolling through her phone. The doors opened at my stop, and I hurried off the train, telling myself it was just my imagination. I made my way up the stairs and out into the rainy evening, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. That's when I noticed the hat. It was sitting on the curb just outside the station entrance, soaked from the rain but unmistakable. The same gray, wide-brimmed hat he had been wearing all those years ago. I froze, staring at it, as a sense of dread washed over me. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Across the street, half hidden in the shadows of an alley, was a figure. He was too far away to make out clearly, but I knew it was him. The same suit, the same stillness, and even though I couldn't see his face, I knew he was smiling. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted, running down the street, my shoes splashing through puddles as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that alley as possible. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, locking the door behind me, collapsing onto the floor. For the past few nights, I've been hearing noises outside my window, a faint chuckle, like someone is standing just out of sight. Sometimes, I'll find wet footprints on the stairs leading up to my door, even though it hasn't rained since that night. I've been trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe the hat had been a coincidence, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But last night made it impossible to deny anymore. He's real, and he's getting closer. It started around 1 a.m. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to tire myself out. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old pipes in my building. Then I heard it, the faint sound of something tapping against my window. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape, no trees close enough to reach the window, nothing that could explain the noise. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to look. The blinds were closed, and for a long moment, I just stared at them, praying the sound would stop. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't frantic or loud, just a soft, deliberate rhythm, like someone was testing the glass. I finally mustered the courage to inch out of bed and peek through the blinds. The street below was empty. No cars, no people, just the dim orange glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. I stared out for what felt like forever, trying to spot anything unusual. Then I realized the tapping hadn't stopped. It was coming from the inside. I spun around, heart hammering, and there he was, standing in the corner of my room, barely visible in the shadows. The same gray suit, the same sunken eyes, the same unnaturally wide grin. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air in the room seemed to shift, heavy and suffocating. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed, and reached for the lamp on my nightstand. The second I turned it on, he was gone. The corner was empty, like he'd never been there at all. But something was different. The hat, the same hat I'd seen on the curb outside the station, was now lying on my dresser. It was dry, and possibly so, and placed neatly as if it belonged there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with every light in the apartment turned on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would actually help me. But he didn't come back, at least, not that I saw. This morning, I tried to throw the hat away. I stuffed it into a trash bag, tied it up, and carried it to the dumpster behind my building. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief, like I'd finally taken control. But when I got back to my apartment, it was waiting for me on the kitchen table. I don't know what he wants, and I don't know how to make it stop. I've thought about running, packing a bag, and leaving the city entirely, but something tells me it won't matter. He found me once after years of silence. He'll find me again. This happened about 6 months ago, but it still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. I work as a delivery driver for a small courier company. The hours are long, but the pay is decent, and I like the solitude of being on the road. That night, I was assigned a late run delivery to package to a remote farm about 30 miles outside of town. The route took me down one of those endless 2-lane highways, pitch black except for the dim glow of my headlights. About halfway there, I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. The pair of headlights appeared out of nowhere, way too close for comfort. It startled me because I hadn't seen another car for miles. The lights were bright, almost blinding, and whoever it was seemed to be tailgating me. I thought about pulling over to let them pass, but every time I slowed down, the car behind me slowed too. If I sped up, they stayed right on my bumper. It felt like a game of chicken, except I was the only one getting scared. After what felt like forever, I finally reached a stretch of road where there was a small turnoff. I took it, hoping the car would keep going, but as soon as I stopped, so did they. I couldn't see much through their headlights, but I could just make out the shape of a large black car. It wasn't moving, but I could feel the weight of someone or something watching me. I rolled down my window slightly to call out, "Hey, do you need something?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. No response. The car just sat there, idling, the silence pressed down on me, broken only by the low hum of my engine and the distant rustling of the wind. Suddenly, their headlights cut out. I froze. Now I could see the silhouette of the car more clearly, and something wasn't right about it. It looked old, like one of those 1950s Cadillacs, but the edges were wrong, too jagged, too angular, almost like it was pieced together from scraps. Then I noticed movement. A figure stepped out of the driver's side. They were tall, unnaturally so, and their gait was stiff, like a puppet on strings. They didn't have a flashlight or a phone, just this lurching, slow walk toward my truck. I panicked. I threw the truck into reverse and gunned it back onto the highway. As I sped away, I looked back and saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me. Their face ... or what I think was their face ... did and look human. It was pale and featureless, almost like a mannequin. I didn't stop again until I reached the farm. When I got there, I was so shaken that the guy I delivered to asked if I was okay. I tried to explain, but I don't think he believed me. Here's the part that really freaks me out. On the way back, I took a different route to avoid the highway. When I got home, I checked the dash cam footage from my truck. The headlights in the car were there ... but the figure wasn't. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was ... off. The encounter replayed in my mind over and over. The strange car, the mannequin-like figure, and the bizarre absence of it in the dash cam footage. It felt like a fever dream, too vivid to dismiss but too surreal to be real. I mentioned it to a co-worker, Steve, who's been with the company for years. I thought maybe he'd brush it off, but his face went pale. "What kind of car did you say it was?" he asked, voice tight. "An old Cadillac," I said. It looked patched together, almost like a junkyard Frankenstein. Steve didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the table like he was deciding whether to speak. Finally, he leaned in and whispered, "You're not the first to see it." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" And Steve explained that over the years, a few drivers have reported seeing a similar car on that highway, always late at night, always following too closely. Some claimed it disappeared as soon as they tried to confront it. Others said they saw the driver, but the descriptions were inconsistent. Some said it was a man in a wide-brimmed hat. Others swore it was a woman with wild hair. One guy even quit after claiming the car forced him off the road, only to vanish when help arrived. Urban legend stuff, Steve said, shrugging. "But you look spooked, so maybe it's more than that." That conversation stuck with me, but I didn't want to obsess over it. I told myself it was probably some weirdo playing pranks, or maybe I'd just been overworked and imagined things. Then, about a week later, I found something strange. I was cleaning out my truck after another late shift when I noticed a smear of something dark on the rear bumper. At first, I thought it was dirt or oil, but when I wiped it with a rag, it came off in long, sticky strands. It was black, but not like oil. It had an iridescent sheen, almost like the surface of a bubble, and it stank. The smell was sharp and chemical, like burnt plastic mixed with decay. I had no idea what it was, but it made my stomach churn. I took a photo of it and sent it to Steve, joking that maybe it was a gift from the creepy car. He didn't find it funny. He texted back immediately, "Throw that rag away and clean your truck." Now, his urgency freaked me out, so I followed his advice. I scrubbed every inch of the truck and tossed the rag in the dumpster behind our depot, but the smell lingered, faint but persistent, like it had seeped into the metal. That night, I had my first nightmare. In it, I was driving down the same highway, except this time, my truck wouldn't move. No matter how hard I pressed the gas, I stayed frozen while the car crept closer and closer in my rearview mirror. The figure got out again, but this time, it wasn't faceless. It had my face, distorted and stretched into a grotesque mockery of a smile. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The nightmares didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, they got worse. Sometimes the figure would bang on my windows, its hands leaving behind those same black, iridescent smears. Other times, I'd wake up feeling like I couldn't breathe, the smell of burnt plastic choking me. I started dreading sleep, dreading work, dreading the highway. Last week, I found another smear on the truck, this time on the windshield. I know for a fact he wasn't there when I parked. The security footage from the depot showed nothing unusual, just my truck sitting in the lot all night. But when I played it back, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the camera glitched just for a second, and when the feed came back, the smear was there. I don't know what's happening, but I've started avoiding night shifts. Steve says he knows someone who can bless the truck, but I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing. All I know is that whatever followed me that night hasn't let go. Things only got worse after that. Despite my best efforts to avoid night shifts, I got called in last Friday to cover for someone. I didn't want to go, but I needed the money. It was supposed to be an easy route, a quick delivery to a warehouse just outside town. I told myself it was fine. I wouldn't take the highway. I wouldn't stay out late. I'd just get it done and get back home. The first half of the night went smoothly. The roads were quiet, the delivery was quick, and I was back in the truck by 9 p.m. I took a side road home, avoiding the highway like I planned. For a while, everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. I noticed the smell first. That awful, burnt plastic stench wafted into the cab, faint but unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I glanced at the dashboard, half expecting some kind of engine issue, but everything was fine. That's when I saw it. In the side mirror, far in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was just another car, nothing to worry about. But as I kept driving, the lights got closer, too close. I tried not to panic, keeping my speed steady, but no matter how fast or slow I went, the car stayed on me like a shadow. Then the headlights flickered, just for a second, and I knew it was the same car. The black, jagged shape, the unnatural way it moved, the way the lights didn't reflect properly off the road, like they were coming from another time or place. I felt trapped, like the walls of the truck were closing in on me. This time, I didn't stop. I kept driving, taking turn after turn, hoping to lose it. But no matter where I went, it followed. I tried calling Steve, but my phone wouldn't work. Every time I dialed, I got static, and then faint whispers like someone was breathing on the line. Finally, I made it to a small gas station. The lights were on, and there were a few cars parked out front. I pulled in, heart pounding, and threw the truck into park. The black car didn't follow me in. It stopped just short of the entrance. I leaned on the edge of the road, its headlights still glaring. I ran inside, desperate to tell someone what was happening. The clerk, a tired-looking guy in his 50-seconds, raised an eyebrow as I stumbled to the counter. "You okay, man?" "There's a car," I stammered. "It's been following me. It's right outside." He looked past me, out the window, then back at me. "I don't see anything." I turned to look, and sure enough, the road was empty. The black car was gone. My stomach sank. "You sure you're okay?" the clerk asked, his tone softer now, like he thought I was losing it. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and bought a bottle of water to calm my nerves. When I got back to the truck, I hesitated before getting in. I didn't see any black smears this time, but the smell was stronger than ever. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating. I drove home in silence, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Every shadow on the road felt like it was watching me. Every flicker of light made my heart race. By the time I got home, I was shaking. When I stepped out of the truck, I noticed something new. On the ground, just behind the rear tires, was a trail of that same black, iridescent substance. It stretched down the driveway and into the street, like something had been dragging itself along behind me. I don't know what to do anymore. Steve thinks I should quit, but part of me feels like this thing won't stop just because I leave the job. I don't even know if it's real or if I'm losing my mind. All I know is that it's getting closer. The dreams, the smells, the smears, they're not going away. I haven't been back on the highway since, and I'm starting to think I never will. Creepy car, or whatever you are, stay away from me. A few weeks ago, my best friend, Mia, and I decided to go for a late night swim at our local community pool. It was a 24-hour facility, and we'd gone a handful of times before when the world was asleep and the water was calm. There was something serene about the silence of an empty pool, just the two of us floating under dim, buzzing lights. This time, though, I wish we'd never gone. It was just after 11 p.m. when we arrived. The parking lot was empty except for an old sedan parked in a corner, its windows fogged up. I remember joking that it looked like someone was living in it, but Mia brushed it off. Probably just a staff member, she said. Inside, the air smelled like chlorine and damp concrete. The receptionist's desk was unmanned, as usual at that hour. We signed ourselves in on the clipboard and walked to the pool. The water was still, reflecting the ceiling lights like a giant, liquid mirror. We swam for about half an hour, taking turns racing each other or floating on our backs. Eventually, Mia suggested we practice holding our breath underwater. She went first, diving to the bottom and staying down for what felt like forever. When she resurfaced, her face was pale. wall. Did you see that? She whispered, her voice trembling. See what? I asked, immediately feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Someone or something. Was at the bottom of the pool. I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, but her expression was dead serious. It's probably just a shadow or your reflection, I said, but when it was my turn to dive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I took a deep breath and dove. The water was cold and silent. I swam to the bottom, and just as I turned to head back up, I saw it. A figure was crouched in the corner of the deep end. It wasn't swimming or floating. It was sitting there, motionless, with its arms wrapped around its knees. I panicked and shot to the surface, gasping for air. There's someone down there, I hissed, looking around wildly. The pool area was still empty except for us, but I felt eyes on me. The kind of feeling where your skin prickles and your instincts scream at you to run. Bea wanted to leave immediately, but I convinced her to stay. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or maybe something left on the pool floor. But deep down, I knew better. We decided to stick to the shallow end, trying to laugh off the unease. I kept glancing toward the deep end, half expecting the figure to surface. That's when the lights flickered, just a quick buzz and dim, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. Then we heard it, a faint, muffled splash. Both of us froze, staring at the far end of the pool. The water was rippling, small waves reaching toward us, but there was no one there. Nope, I'm done, Mia said, climbing out. I wasn't far behind her. We grabbed our towels and practically ran to the locker room. I turned back once, just before we rounded the corner. The ripples had stopped, and the pool was still again, but I swear, I saw something bobbing just beneath the surface. In the locker room, we hurried to change, barely speaking. Just as I was pulling on my hoodie, I heard it again, a faint splash, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. White footsteps. I looked at Mia, who was frozen, her eyes wide with fear. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the tiled room. They stopped just outside of her stall. We didn't dare breathe. The door creaked slightly, and through the gap, I saw a bare, wet foot, pale as death, standing inches from the door. We bolted, not bothering to finish dressing. As we ran out, I glanced toward the pool one last time. The water was completely still, but the figure was standing at the edge now, watching us leave. We haven't been back to that pool since. For days after that night, I couldn't shake the image of the figure at the pool's edge. Its unnaturally pale skin, the way it seemed to shimmer under the dim lights, and the fact that it didn't chase us, all of it haunted my thoughts. Leah refused to talk about it. Anytime I brought it up, she'd quickly change the subject or insist she didn't see anything. One night, about a week later, I woke up to a strange dream. I was underwater, struggling to reach the surface, but something was holding my ankle. When I looked down, I saw the same pale figure from the pool. Its face was featureless, just smooth, white flesh, and yet I could feel it staring at me. Its grip tightened as I fought to break free, and just as I thought my lungs would give out, I woke up gasping for air. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but deep down, I felt it was more than that. I started avoiding water altogether, no showers, just quick rinses, and I couldn't even bring myself to fill a sink without feeling a sense of dread. Then, Mia called me late one night. She sounded frantic. "It's here," she whispered. What's there?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I don't know, but I can hear it," she said. "There's water on my floor, like someone walked through here soaking wet. I keep hearing splashing. It's like it's following me." I tried to calm her down, but before I could say much, she screamed. The call ended abruptly. I drove to her house as fast as I could. When I got there, her front door was slightly open and the lights inside flickered. The house was eerily quiet except for a faint dripping sound. "Leah," I called out, stepping inside. My voice echoed. I followed the sound of the dripping to the bathroom. The floor was wet and the faucet was running, though no one was there. My stomach dropped when I noticed something, wet footprints leading from the bathroom to her bedroom. I hesitated but forced myself to follow the trail. The door to her room was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, calling her name again. The room was empty, but the window was open, curtains billowing in the breeze. The footprints stopped at the window. I leaned out, looking into the yard below, but there was nothing, just darkness. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. It was a text from Mia's number, "Help me." I didn't know what to do. The police weren't going to believe a word of this, and I couldn't even begin to explain what was happening. I searched the house top to bottom, but Mia was gone. The last thing I found chilled me to my core. On her kitchen counter was a damp, folded piece of paper. When I opened it, there was only one thing written in shaky, water-streaked handwriting. "Don't go back to the pool." The weeks following Mia's disappearance blurred together. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and the sound of water, any water, filled me with a bone-deep terror. The police came to question me several times, but there was little I could say without sounding insane. We went swimming, and then she disappeared was the most I could manage. Then came the dreams. They started as shadows in water, vague and distant. Over time, they became more vivid. I would be back at the pool, the water impossibly dark and deep, pulling me down. That figure, pale, featureless, would be waiting, its arms outstretched, its presence suffocating. One night, I woke up choking on the taste of chlorine. I tried everything to move on. Therapy, meditation, even a brief attempt to research the history of the pool. But there was nothing unusual about it. No urban legends, no mysterious drownings, no logical explanation for what we saw. Just a regular community pool with a long history of chlorine treatments and kids swim lessons. Then, 3 weeks after Mia vanished, I found something on my doorstep. A water-damaged envelope, warped and streaked as if it had been left out in the rain. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of the pool, taken from the deep end. The surface of the water was still, but in the bottom corner of the image, something was visible, something pale and humanoid, crouching just beneath the surface. There was no note, no explanation, and no sign of who had left it. That same night, I began hearing the splashes again. The first time I heard it, I thought it was in my head. A faint, rhythmic splash, like someone swimming in slow motion. I checked my faucets, my pipes, even my backyard, thinking it might be a leak. But everything was dry. The sound stopped as soon as I stopped searching, but it came back the next night. In the night after that, by the fourth night, the sound had grown louder, more distinct. It wasn't just splashing anymore. I could hear the faint echo of footsteps, wet and heavy, slapping against the ground. It was always distant, always just beyond where I could see, but it was getting closer. I started sleeping with the lights on, as if that would keep it at bay. One night, I woke up to find the lights flickering. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was another text from Mia's number. It's her. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The splashing grew louder, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of dripping water. I forced myself to look toward the doorway of my bedroom. The floor was wet, water pooled in uneven streaks, leading toward my bed. I grabbed my phone and bolted, slipping on the slick floor as I ran for the front door. I didn't care that I was barefoot or that it was the middle of the night. I just needed to get out. I drove aimlessly for hours, not knowing where to go. The streets were deserted, the night eerily quiet except for the occasional sound of my tires on wet pavement. It wasn't raining, but the road glistened as if it had just been drenched. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of the community pool. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find answers. Maybe I thought I'd find Mia. The old sedan was still there, sitting in the same corner, windows fogged. My breath hitched as I realized I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just sat there, staring straight ahead. I turned away and walked toward the building. The door was unlocked, as it always was, and the reception desk was empty. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the faint smell of chlorine hanging in the air. The pool was just as I remembered it, still, quiet. The water glistened under the dim lights, and for a moment, I thought I was alone, but then I saw it. The figure. It was in the deep end, floating just beneath the surface. Its head was tilted back, its body unnaturally stiff, its pale, featureless face staring up at the ceiling. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Mia's number helped me. Against every instinct, I stepped closer. The figure didn't move. The water around it was unnaturally calm, like it was frozen in place. "Leah," I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure's head snapped toward me. I stumbled back, slipping on the wet tiles, and hit the ground hard. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The water was rippling violently, and for a moment, I thought it had disappeared. But then I heard it, the sound of wet footsteps coming toward me. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, the feeling of cold, wet hands grabbing me, the sound of water filling my ears, and a voice, Mia's voice, whispering, "It's not done." When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the pool area, drenched and alone. My phone was gone, so was the figure. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.